Dear friends, it is my task now to tell you why have we failed to cure Alzheimer's disease. So, לא עוברת, שיקופית לא עוברת. עכשיו עברה. Dear friends, good morning to you, or good afternoon, wherever you are. It is my task now to tell you, explain to you why we have failed to cure Alzheimer's disease so far. And the reasons are rather simple. First, of course, I have to declare that I have no conflicts of interest. We all know that dementia is a public health priority, which we try to solve. Of course, it's an epidemic, 50 million people affected worldwide and 150,000 here in Israel. And the bad news is that there is no cure in sight. It all started with Augusta D 120 years ago exactly, where Alois Alzheimer described the disease that now bears his name. And he was talking about not what we're talking about now in this epidemic. He was talking about presenile dementia. And this presenile dementia is actually an orphan disease. It's a rare disease. It is not an early onset form of senile dementia of the Alzheimer type. Young onset Alzheimer disease, like Augusta D had, is a genetic disorder. In her case, it was caused by a mutation in the presenilin-1 gene, and this is a rare disorder. But we're talking now about sporadic late onset Alzheimer's disease. So what is Alzheimer's disease really? So we know what it looks like. I know what it looks like when we see patients. The pathologists not know what it looks like when they look through the microscope, but we don't know what it is. And this is an essential issue, that we don't know what Alzheimer's disease is. And therefore, so many attempts have been made to try and get rid of Alzheimer's disease by targeting mitochondrial dysfunction or lysosomal or maybe toxic damage. You remember the aluminum story and now the iron story that we've heard about this morning, or oxidative stress or enzyme dysfunction, and so on and so on. Each one shows that we really do not know what Alzheimer's disease is. And Alzheimer's disease, of course, by definition, is the following: a clinical pathological entity of progressive dementia with specific neuropathological changes. It is a complex problem. And the complexity is shown by this definition, because this definition makes Alzheimer's disease unique. There is no other disease in which the definition of the disease requires both the clinical manifestation and the pathological manifestations. We need both in order to be sure that we have Alzheimer's disease. And this is so because the clinical manifestations are in many cases inaccurate. We now know that there are other things that can cause similar stories. In fact, the accuracy of the clinical diagnosis has been shown to be wrong in about 1/3 of the cases that have been diagnosed by the best centers in the world. And also, on the other hand, the pathology is insufficient by itself, because there are so many people, older people, who have amyloid plaques and tangles without significant cognitive impairment. So in elderly people, my age, there are so many people who carry the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, but do not have dementia and are not on the way to develop dementia. So what is Alzheimer's disease? Is it really a disease? What do I mean by that? What is a disease? Of course, diseases do not exist. The term disease is an abstract concept, and which encompasses the underlying process with a common etiology, pathogenesis, evolution, and pathology. And in what we call Alzheimer's disease now, the late onset Alzheimer's disease. We don't have a common etiology. We don't have the same pathogenesis all the time. And just looking at the pathology is not enough. And to illustrate the point, I will ask you whether pneumonia is a disease. And of course, everybody knows that pneumonia is a disease. But in reality, it is not. There are many, many different forms of pneumonia. There is bacterial pneumonia, there is COVID-19 pneumonia, there is toxic pneumonia. Each of them is different from the other. They are all pneumonia. They all share the same markers of the disease. The same clinical phenotype, like shortness of breath, etc. Same radiological manifestations, the same pathology, and the biomarkers like fever and hypoxemia and whatever. So this is because of phenotypic convergence. So all the attacks on the lung culminate in the same thing, culminate in what the lung can manifest as a dementia, as a pneumonia with its different thing. So actually, pneumonia is a syndrome. There is no pneumonia as a disease. Of course, there are people who suffer from pneumonia, but this is not that they all suffer from the same thing. They suffer from different things, and therefore they require different types of treatment. So let's go back to Alzheimer's disease and ask ourselves whether Alzheimer's disease, and again, I'm speaking now about the sporadic form, is sporadic Alzheimer's disease a disease? And in patients with mutations, of course, presenile dementia is a disease. We know what is the cause, we understand the mechanism and the resulting phenotype. Not so in the senile late onset dementia. So Down syndrome is actually a disease, but sporadic late onset Alzheimer's disease is a syndrome. The syndrome is a disease and the disease is a syndrome. Make sure that you take this into consideration. In pneumonia, the clinician is expected to find the cause in any given person. But in sporadic Alzheimer's disease, this is not so. There is no single cause because this is a multifactorial disorder. So you cannot find one single etiological component that leads to it. So in late onset Alzheimer's disease, we don't know what the cause is or the underlying process. Of course, we have identified risk factors. But in late onset Alzheimer's disease, there is no common etiology, and we rely on the pathology, on the end result, and this is misleading. So the risk factors that have been identified, of course, we all know: age, gender, poor education, head trauma, and the genetic form of ApoE4 that we'll hear more about soon. But we talk about about age as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. What do we mean by age? This is an obscure term. Is it because older people have comorbidities? Is it because inflammation is common in older people, or oxidative stress, or what have you? So just saying that age is a risk factor does not mean much. And the same goes for gender. Why do women suffer more? Is it because they have hormonal changes or whatever? We don't know. So we also have these hyper risk factors, as I call them: hypertension, hyperlipidemia, hyperglycemia, hypernicotinemia, hyperhomocystinemia perhaps, and so on. And in opposition to this one, which we cannot change, this one can be changed. So there are also other lifestyle risk factors which we can manipulate, like overweight, loneliness, alcoholism, poor sleep, poor physical fitness, and also hearing loss and visual loss. Also the genetic markers that have been identified, ApoE, it's the most common one. So what I want to conclude with is that cognitive impairment is really a can result from many factors in combination. So there is at the top genetic predisposition. This is not enough. Not everybody who carries the APOE4 will develop Alzheimer's disease. You need other things like microvascular disease or other things. And it is very unlikely that all these different causes have the same pathogenic mechanism. Remember phenotypic convergence. Like in pneumonia, the brain manifests these different results, same different processes resulting in the same changes that like plaques and tangles and neuronal loss. So unlike early Alzheimer's disease, unlike pneumonia, unlike liver cirrhosis, late onset Alzheimer's disease, as I said before, a multifactorial disorder. There are many causes of late onset Alzheimer's disease, and no two persons have exactly the same combination of factors. The similarity of the clinical and pathological pictures of young onset and late onset Alzheimer's disease is again due to phenotypic conversions. They result from different processes, different etiology, and they end up having the same pathological features. So these plaques and tangles that we really look at as the defining pathological picture of Alzheimer's disease is really only part of the truth, because what is important is not what is deposited. What is important is what being lost. So in Alzheimer's disease, there is loss of tissue. And this has been known for many, many years. So Bob Kassman and Bob Terry many, many years ago with Eli Matzliach and others have shown that the important thing in cognitive changes of Alzheimer's disease is synaptic loss. So this was back in 1991, and soon after, and this has been confirmed repeatedly, for example, lately by this paper from Brazil by Leah Greenberg and her group, who showed that it is the cell number changes, the neuronal loss, which is related to dementia, not plaques and tangles. So soon after the paper which I've just showed you of Katz and Matzliach, came this other paper by John Hardy, who showed that Alzheimer's disease, and they formulated the amyloid cascade hypothesis, which changed our thinking of this problem. So the amyloid as a cause became a new concept. Amyloid, which used to be a biomarker, was upgraded to a status of the active player. And here is the picture to show how everything boils down to plaques and tangles and ending in what was called Alzheimer's disease. Why target amyloid? Just because it is there? Amyloid deposition in the brain have never been adequately explained. It has never been shown to be neurotoxic. And even if it were, correlation does not prove causation. And for those of you who want another demonstration that correlation does not prove causation, here is the important paper published in the New England some years ago, looking at the correlation between chocolate consumption in different countries and cognitive function, and how many Nobel Prizes were given in each country. And you may be surprised to see that there is an excellent correlation between the chocolate consumption in each country and the number of Nobel laureates from that country, with a very, very significantly low p-value. So here is the correlation, and you note that there are two outstanding here, Germany, and we all know why Germany did not have many Nobel Prizes in the 20th century. What we cannot explain is why Sweden is at the top, outside of the range. Why does Sweden get more than its share. But this is a question that I don't want to go into. Now, again, coming back to the issue that I mentioned before, there are many people, older people, who have amyloid and tau deposits, and they will never develop dementia. And I wrote many years ago that about the problem with the amyloid cascade hypothesis, why it's not a good target to look at. There's so many attempts to eliminate amyloid have failed to have a clinical effect. It's not that these anti-amyloid therapies, whether genetic, whether immune or biochemical, have not succeeded in removing amyloid. Amyloid has been removed, but there was no clinical effect. And therefore, we should understand this. So as Thomas Huxley said many, many years ago, the great tragedy of science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by ugly facts. And this is what happened with the amyloid hypothesis. It was a nice hypothesis, but the facts disprove it. And Karl Popper, the greatest science philosopher ever, and one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, coined the term of falsification. And he said that for a scientific theory to be real scientific, for any theory to be scientific, it must be, we must be able to falsify it. But the amyloid theory cannot be falsified. Therefore, it is not a scientific theory. Why do I say that it cannot be falsified? Because it's a moving target. People thought about plaques, and their moving flux did not change much, so they looked at monomers and then oligomers or fibrils or intracellular rather than extracellular. And now they say, we did all this, but we did it too late. We should have started earlier. This is a prevailing view. But this is not a good explanation, because people who come to me and whom I diagnose with Alzheimer's disease, what I want to see is that these people, they tell me that what they want is for me to stop the progression of the disease. And I say, I cannot tell them, look, you should have come 20 years ago. They want to stop the progression of the disease now. And this is something that we cannot do for them. So the moving targets are still there, and therefore, whatever we'll do, we cannot solve the problems. And if amyloid and tau are, as I say, downstream molecules, the question is, what is upstream? What causes amyloid to be deposited? What causes tau to be hyperphosphorylated? And this we don't know. So then there is the other issue of the patients with senile dementia have multiple pathologies. Of course, not only amyloid and tau, but also TDP-43, and of course, vascular changes. And many years ago, I said that senile dementia, the main cause of senile dementia is not Alzheimer's disease, but rather mixed dementia is the most common cause. So all patients who have Alzheimer's changes, almost all of them have other changes like tau pathology and also TDP-43. So I look at what we call Alzheimer's disease, senile Alzheimer's disease, as an end result of a neurodegenerative disorder related to aging, resulting from cumulative effects of several genetic perturbations, polymorphisms, and environmental factors. And therefore, the take-home message is that there is no Alzheimer's disease. There is late onset Alzheimer's disease is actually a syndrome. Amyloid and tau are false therapeutic targets. Late onset Alzheimer's disease cannot be cured, but it can be prevented or at least delayed. And this reminds me of the important paper, important book that I read to my grandchildren, where Alice travels on the train in Alice through the mirror glass, and the conductor of the train looks at her, and at the time, all the time, the guard was looking at her, first through a telescope, then through a microscope, and then through an opera glass. At last he said, "You are traveling the wrong way, my dear." And this is what happens now with Alzheimer's disease. We have been traveling the wrong way. We need a new roadmap. Against multifactorial disease, we need a multifactorial approach. And the fighting AD aiming at a single target is useless. We've heard similar words from Musayudim this morning. We have to fight the exacerbating factors, cardiovascular comorbidities, sleep impairment, sensory problems, social isolation, and so on. We have to enhance mitigating factors. So looking for the magic bullet is wrong. Rather than aiming at unrealistic, unvalidated targets, we should realize that the situation is more complex, but achievable. So thank you very much for this. I want to end and leave some time for questions if we can. And I want to invite you all to this meeting that we organize every year now for the 17th time. We'll be in beautiful Dubrovnik. And in this meeting, we really ask the difficult neurological questions. In each of them, each of the topics, we have a pro and a con speakers who fight each other. Each has 10 or 15 minutes to present their case. I can present my case that amyloid is wrong. Somebody else will come up and prove to you or try to prove to you that I'm wrong, that amyloid is still the good target, and we're going to show each other. So this exercise is a teaching exercise where people see the problems that we have with each issue. So thank you very much for your attention. And as I said, I leave some time always for questions. Thank you very much.